Ladies first.
January 1946. A brittle winter morning seeps through the skeletal remains of a bombed-out German town. The streets are quiet, littered with shattered glass and splintered wood, smoke still curling from distant fires that refuse to die. In the midst of this devastation, a group of German women, POWs, shuffles through the snow toward the gates of a U.S.-run camp. Their breaths rise in thin clouds, eyes wary, hands clutching threadbare coats against the cold. Inside the compound, American soldiers move with calm precision, rifles slung but posture relaxed, their voices polite, measured. A small gesture, almost imperceptible, freezes the women in place. A U.S. guard steps aside, nodding, "Ladies first." The words hang in the air like a strange wind, dissonant in a world that had demanded their silence, obedience, and invisibility. Confusion flickers across their faces. Some hesitate, others glance at each other, uncertain whether to advance or retreat. For the first time in months, perhaps years, their presence is acknowledged not as prisoners, but as individuals. And in that pause, history holds its breath. By early 1946, Europe bore the scars of 6 years of total war. Cities across Germany were leveled by relentless Allied bombing campaigns. Factories, hospitals, railways, and residential blocks lay in ruin, and millions of civilians struggled to survive amid the cold and shortages. The Third Reich had collapsed in May 1945, surrendering unconditionally after Berlin fell and Hitler had taken his own life. Yet the remnants of German society, both military and civilian, faced a new reality under Allied occupation, and every corner of daily life became a negotiation between survival and accountability. Among the thousands swept into this post-war landscape were German women who had served in auxiliary military roles. These included clerks, communications operators, medical staff, and support personnel attached to Wehrmacht units. Their duties, once confined to the shadow of male command, had been carried out with rigid discipline and near-complete obedience. Unlike combat soldiers, their presence rarely featured in official records of battle or strategic planning, yet they had managed critical aspects of military infrastructure, coordinating supply chains, maintaining field hospitals, documenting troop movements, and sustaining the bureaucratic machinery of war. When the Allies established POW camps specifically for women, the objective was both containment and debriefing. Camps like the ones in France, Belgium, and later in the American-controlled zones of Germany became sites of paradoxical exposure. Here, the women were free from frontline danger but stripped of autonomy, their lives regulated by rules designed for efficiency, security, and intelligence gathering. They were subject to roll calls, daily inspections, and the scrutiny of American officers trained to extract information while maintaining humane treatment. For many, this represented an unfamiliar environment where fear and mistrust competed with curiosity and cautious relief. The U.S. Army's approach to female POWs differed sharply from traditional German military norms. Whereas the Wehrmacht had emphasized absolute hierarchy and obedience, American occupation policy allowed for measured agency. Women were encouraged to speak about their roles, provide factual reports on logistics, medical care, and personnel movements, and even to highlight operational failures. This policy reflected a pragmatic philosophy. Intelligence, after all, was most reliable when derived from those with first-hand experience. The Americans sought precision, not confession. They wanted data, corroborated observations, and insight into a system that had largely been opaque to outside scrutiny. Cultural dissonance intensified the psychological impact. German society in 1945 to 46 had been shaped by decades of patriarchal militarism and authoritarian rule. Women officers, though formally part of military auxiliary services, had internalized strict norms of silence and submission. Speaking openly, particularly about mistakes or inefficiencies, had been inconceivable. The rigid discipline of the Third Reich had conditioned them to suppress personal judgment, equating obedience with loyalty and initiative with risk. For the American officers, this silence was not evidence of complicity, but a potential reservoir of untapped knowledge. For the German women, being asked questions, simple, direct questions, produced hesitation, confusion, and in some cases, profound disbelief. The early months of the occupation were also a time of logistical chaos. Cities like Hamburg, Dresden, Cologne, and Berlin had been heavily bombed. Transportation networks were destroyed, food, fuel, and medical supplies were scarce. Women POWs, particularly those with medical or administrative backgrounds, were uniquely positioned to provide insight into the functioning of hospitals under duress, evacuation procedures during air raids, and methods of rationing that had kept some communities alive despite systemic collapse. Their testimonies, once collected, would form a critical part of the Allied efforts to stabilize the region and rebuild essential infrastructure. Meanwhile, the physical conditions of the camps themselves mirrored the dissonance of the post-war environment. Shelters were sparse but serviceable, with rows of cots, communal kitchens, and guarded perimeters. While American policy emphasized humane treatment, including adequate food, hygiene, and access to correspondence, the experience of confinement was jarring. For many women, the combination of unfamiliar authority figures, lingering mistrust of the Allies, and the need to recall experiences long suppressed created a tense psychological landscape. Yet these camps became more than prisons. They were classrooms, archives, and laboratories where the boundaries of wartime obedience and personal agency began to shift. It was in this setting, snow-dusted grounds, watchful guards, and makeshift classrooms, that the extraordinary moment occurred. A simple act of courtesy, a phrase like "ladies first," could unsettle years of conditioning, forcing the women to confront the unexpected acknowledgement of their individuality. In this environment, the line between past subjugation and emerging authority began to blur, laying the groundwork for their eventual role in reconstruction efforts. Their insights, painstakingly recorded, would serve as a bridge between the strict hierarchies of Imperial Germany and the more open, feedback-driven structures employed by the Allies. Inside the POW camps, German women officers faced a reality that juxtaposed order and uncertainty. Barracks were functional but Spartan. Wooden cots lined narrow rooms. Blankets were rationed, and personal belongings were minimal. Yet within this austerity, the women found themselves unexpectedly at the center of a new kind of attention. American officers, often young but experienced, approached debriefings with methodical precision. Their questions were not accusatory. They sought operational clarity. How were supplies allocated? How did hospitals cope during intensive bombing raids? How were volunteer corps trained and deployed? Each query invited detailed recollection, compelling the women to transform routine survival into structured testimony. The process was gradual. Initial interviews were short, measured, and sometimes stilted. Many women answered in monosyllables, their faces revealing a mixture of suspicion, apprehension, and the residual stress of wartime vigilance. The American officers, aware of cultural and psychological barriers, employed a deliberate patience. Silence was tolerated, repetition encouraged, and cross-referencing with documents and camp logs reinforced the legitimacy of the women's observations. Over days and weeks, the women began to recount procedures that had previously gone unnoticed. They described improvised rationing methods, emergency hospital setups, and communication protocols during air raids. Even minor decisions, how a scarce medicine was allocated or how an evacuation route was organized, became data points of immense value. Cultural friction persisted. In the German military system, mistakes were private and initiative was invisible. In the Allied framework, transparency was functional and necessary. The very act of verbalizing experiences, long suppressed under the Third Reich, was revolutionary. Women who had spent years meticulously recording orders, schedules, and patient movements were suddenly acknowledged not merely as executors of commands, but as authorities in their own right. Diaries, once personal and often hidden, gained new importance. Each page, each notation, became a piece of evidence corroborating broader operational patterns. The Allied officers recognized that the cumulative knowledge of these women offered insights unavailable through standard reports, uncovering the human dimension behind bureaucratic records. Beyond the operational, there was the human element. Many women had witnessed the devastation of civilian populations, the suffering of soldiers, and the collapse of a nation. Their testimonies were tinged with grief, guilt, and, in some cases, reluctant pride. They spoke of colleagues lost to air raids, hospitals overwhelmed by casualties, and the moral compromises imposed by necessity. American officers listened without judgment, creating an environment where reflection was permitted and, crucially, valued. It was a stark contrast to their prior experience, where hierarchy dictated silence and personal insight was discouraged. This period also highlighted contrasts between gender roles in the occupying and occupied forces. American women officers, members of the Women's Army Corps and other branches, operated with unprecedented authority. They led intelligence operations, coordinated administrative tasks, and spoke directly with male officers, an anomaly for the German women accustomed to subordination. Witnessing these interactions challenged entrenched perceptions of authority and competence, providing a live demonstration that competence, not gender, determined influence. For German women, the realization was both unsettling and empowering. The notion that their knowledge could matter outside the rigid hierarchy of the Reich slowly took root. The practical outcomes of these engagements were immediate and measurable. Reports generated from interviews informed the organization of displaced persons camps, restructured hospital administration, and improved logistical planning for food and medicine distribution. Operational inefficiencies once invisible in German records were now documented, analyzed, and mitigated. Even in the psychological realm, the recognition of expertise had tangible effects. Women reported increased confidence, a sense of moral clarity, and the beginnings of a personal agency long denied under the previous regime. Meanwhile, the camps themselves became microcosms of broader societal transformation. As months passed, the women were increasingly treated not simply as prisoners, but as contributors to a transitional administration. Their observations were solicited in group discussions, integrated into planning documents, and cited in reports that would later guide Reconstruction. Small acts of respect, like courteous speech and deliberate inclusion in decision-making, reinforced the message. Their insights were essential. Over time, these interactions reshaped not only the operational landscape of post-war Germany, but also the women's perception of their own roles and capacities. By the end of 1946, the foundation had been laid for a profound shift. The combination of personal testimony, operational expertise, and cross-cultural observation had elevated the status of German women officers from silent participants in a destructive hierarchy to active informants and advisors. Their contributions, once invisible, were now codified into the emerging administrative framework of occupied Germany. The stage was set to explore the multiple angles of this transformation: human, tactical, technological, moral, and cultural, that would reveal the depth and complexity of their experience. The human dimension of the German women officers' experience is as compelling as any battlefield maneuver. These were individuals shaped by decades of strict military discipline, social expectation, and personal sacrifice. Many had been nurses, clerks, or administrative officers within the Wehrmacht, performing critical duties in hospitals, supply depots, and regional command centers. Their days had been measured in routines. The precise administration of medicine, the meticulous recording of troop movements, and the quiet endurance of moral and physical stress. Yet the war had imposed layers of trauma: loss of colleagues, bombardment of cities, scarcity of food and resources, and the omnipresent tension of authority. When American officers invited them to speak, the simple act of verbalizing experiences became a profound human reckoning. Hesitation, disbelief, and subtle pride intermingled in their expressions. They were discovering that their knowledge and judgment, previously invisible and undervalued, carried weight. Observers noted the transformation. Stoic faces softened, eyes brightened with engagement, and gestures grew more confident. This human awakening underscored a fundamental truth. Even in the machinery of war, personal experience retained moral and operational significance. From a tactical perspective, the women's testimonies illuminated the inner workings of German wartime logistics and hospital management. In areas previously hidden from Allied intelligence, they provided detailed accounts of supply shortages, patient flow during air raids, and the improvisation of care under resource constraints. They described how medical units redistributed personnel when casualties overwhelmed a single hospital wing, how food rations were rationed and allocated, and how communication networks functioned under blackout conditions. Each operational insight revealed the improvisational skill necessary to maintain efficiency in a collapsing system. For instance, one officer described coordinating staff during a March 1945 air raid in Berlin. Nurses moved between wards, clerks rerouted essential documents, and doctors prioritized cases under extreme duress. These accounts allowed American intelligence to map procedural strengths and weaknesses within the German administration, offering a rare view into the tactical logic applied by those often overlooked in wartime reports. The tactical revelations also highlighted the ingenuity demanded by scarcity, exposing a layer of organizational resilience that official records failed to capture. Leadership, as practiced by these women, was paradoxical, exercised invisibly, yet crucial for survival. The Imperial German system emphasized hierarchy and obedience, leaving little room for initiative. Women were expected to execute orders flawlessly, but rarely to direct operations independently. However, the cumulative effect of small decisions, allocating scarce medicines, organizing evacuation drills, or coordinating volunteer staff, demonstrated an understated but decisive form of leadership. American observers recognized this subtle competence. In debriefings, women articulated how they maintained discipline among subordinates, anticipated crises, and implemented ad hoc solutions to unprecedented challenges. Their leadership was neither formal nor recognized in rank insignia, yet was indispensable to operational continuity. Witnessing their careful explanations, officers noted a stark contrast between formal authority and functional command. The women's ability to influence outcomes, despite systemic suppression of their voice, offered a powerful case study in distributed leadership under extreme conditions. Technology, in the context of German women officers' experience, was both a tool and a barrier. Medical instruments, communication devices, and logistical machinery dictated the pace and effectiveness of operations. Many officers described the challenges posed by shortages. Typewriters for record-keeping were often shared between departments. Radios functioned intermittently due to fuel and maintenance constraints, and field medical equipment was frequently outdated or damaged by bombing raids. They explained how these limitations affected decision-making, forcing improvisation and creative problem-solving. In hospitals, triage procedures relied on both skill and ingenuity. Women officers devised alternative sterilization techniques, rationed scarce anesthesia, and coordinated transport for wounded soldiers using available vehicles. The technology they managed was seldom cutting-edge, yet their intimate understanding of these tools and systems was essential. Their testimony provided Allied officers with rare insight into the interplay between human expertise and technological limitation in wartime Germany, highlighting how operational efficiency often depended more on adaptive skill than on equipment superiority. The moral dimension of their work was profound and complex. German women officers were bound by duty, obedience, and a rigid military hierarchy, yet daily decisions carried ethical weight. They recounted moments of moral tension, rationing limited medicine among severely wounded patients, prioritizing certain communications over others, or witnessing acts of brutality without the power to intervene. This silence was enforced by the systemic belief that personal judgment was secondary to state directives. When American officers asked for their perspective, these women were confronted with an unfamiliar form of validation. Their experiences were not only recorded, but respected. This recognition prompted introspection and, in some cases, lingering guilt. Some officers expressed relief that their careful efforts to maintain humanity under extreme conditions were acknowledged. Others grappled with the moral implications of complicity in broader military operations. Their reflections reveal a profound intersection of duty, conscience, and survival in total war. Cultural contrast was stark in these interactions. Women raised within German military and social norms were accustomed to strict hierarchy, deference, and suppression of personal voice. The American approach, encouraging open discussion, valuing individual insight, and allowing women to speak directly to officers, was revolutionary. Observers noted confusion, hesitation, and cautious engagement as the women navigated unfamiliar expectations. Yet this cross-cultural encounter illuminated possibilities. Personal judgment and initiative were not only tolerated but respected. The experience challenged long-held assumptions about authority, gender, and the role of individual perspective. It demonstrated that culture shapes operational behavior as much as strategy or technology, and that acknowledgement of experience can catalyze empowerment and institutional insight. April 1945. The air in the U.S.-run POW camps was heavy with the smell of damp earth and smoke, remnants of Allied bombardments that had scarred the surrounding towns. German women officers, many in their early 20s, moved quietly along the barbed wire corridors, their uniforms still crisp but their faces etched with the fatigue of long months in captivity. They had been trained to follow orders without hesitation, to suppress personal initiative, and to measure every word. Authority had been absolute, and questioning it was unthinkable. The moment of disruption came not through violence, but through words. American guards, part of the occupation forces, initiated a series of procedural changes designed to test cooperation and, unknowingly, to challenge the mental conditioning of the women. For the first time, they were asked simple questions that carried no threat of reprimand. "Ladies first," one officer had said during the morning roll call, a phrase so foreign in tone and implication that officers paused, brows furrowed, unsure of how to respond. Confusion rippled through the ranks. Some smiled nervously, others froze entirely. It was a gesture that carried more weight than any command. It redefined agency, even momentarily, in a system built on rigid hierarchy. Within the administrative offices, a quieter transformation was occurring. The women were called upon to provide accounts of operational procedures, resource allocation, and personnel management during the final months of the Third Reich. At first, responses were hesitant. Diaries had been written in secret, observations shared only with trusted peers. But the Americans, trained in systematic debriefing and intelligence gathering, allowed for time, pauses, and follow-up questions. As notebooks filled with careful handwriting, the officers began to realize that their knowledge, once dismissed or ignored, was now central to the functioning of the camp. Specific incidents were recounted with startling clarity. One officer described how hospital wards had been reorganized after repeated air raids, detailing makeshift triage areas, ration medicine, and improvised transport for the wounded. Another recounted the breakdown of communication lines after a bombing destroyed regional offices, and how she coordinated staff rotations to maintain operations under pressure. Every detail, previously invisible in official reports, began to form a coherent picture of operational reality. The Americans, in turn, recognized the significance. They began cross-referencing the women's accounts with supply logs, personnel rosters, and prior camp reports. What emerged was undeniable. Gaps and inaccuracies in official documentation were illuminated, while the women's recollections consistently aligned. The realization was slow, almost imperceptible, but seismic. The prisoners, once invisible cogs in a rigid military machine, were now authoritative witnesses. Their perspective mattered. For the women themselves, the psychological impact was immediate. Eyes widened, shoulders shifted. A quiet pride mingled with disbelief. Some allowed themselves to speak with tentative confidence, recounting procedures that had saved lives or mitigated chaos. Others wrestled with the weight of decisions made under duress, the ethical compromises of survival, and the magnitude of their newly acknowledged expertise. The act of being listened to, without interruption or judgment, was revolutionary. Outside the offices, the world remained scarred. Smoke from distant fires lingered, rubble crunched under boots, and the cold April wind carried reminders of a war just ended. Yet within these walls, the foundations of authority, gender roles, and operational hierarchy were quietly shifting. Knowledge, once confined to obedience, was now a source of power. The turning point was not marked by artillery or surrender, but by recognition, a subtle, transformative acknowledgement of human agency. The stage was set for broader implications. These sessions would inform Reconstruction, influence occupation policies, and demonstrate the critical value of previously marginalized voices. The juxtaposition of silence and expression, obedience and initiative, past and potential, had reached a climax, poised to ripple beyond the immediate context of the camp. And yet, even in this moment of psychological and procedural upheaval, the women were only beginning to grasp the full weight of their contributions. The next months would reveal just how far these insights would reach and how profoundly they would reshape understanding of operational history, human resilience, and the capacity for systemic transformation. By late April 1945, the procedural debriefings had grown more structured. American officers in charge of intelligence and camp administration began methodically cataloging every account provided by the German women. Diaries, letters, and oral testimonies were scrutinized, compared, and cross-referenced. A striking pattern emerged. Repeated observations from separate individuals confirmed incidents that had been entirely absent from official reports. Supply shortages, repeated air raid protocols, improvised medical procedures. Each detail, once invisible in bureaucratic records, now gained authority through cumulative verification. The psychological weight of this recognition was palpable. German women officers, many still in their early 20s and conditioned to defer to male authority, were confronted with a reality that had never existed in their military training. Their knowledge mattered, their voices were valid, and their experience could shape decisions at an institutional level. Nervous glances and hesitations gradually gave way to measured, precise accounts. Some spoke with trembling hands but unwavering factuality, recounting the exact quantities of rations distributed, the rotations of nursing staff, and the improvised logistics implemented during crises. The act of documentation became an assertion of existence. One particularly intense session took place in a dimly lit office, papers spread across a long wooden table. American officers asked for operational details surrounding a series of air raids in central Germany, including casualty counts, evacuation procedures, and hospital workflow. A young officer, who had once meticulously noted every detail in her diary, hesitated before describing the improvisations she had orchestrated when supplies ran critically low. The Americans listened without interruption, their notebooks capturing each nuance. In that silence, the women realized their authority was unchallenged, that their judgment was being treated as a resource, not as a subordinate obligation. Meanwhile, the verification process began to expose discrepancies in prior records. One logistics sheet, a routine documentation of supplies delivered to the camp in February 1945, matched a recollection given by 3 different women officers. The alignment was precise. The timing, the quantities, the observed shortages. What was once dismissed as anecdotal or unreliable now had the imprimatur of bureaucratic confirmation. The women's memories, once silenced, were validated through meticulous comparison. This confluence of human testimony and documentary evidence represented a turning point not only in the administration of the camp, but in the broader perception of women's operational knowledge. Emotionally, the impact was profound. For some, the validation of their work brought relief, a sense of vindication for months of careful observation and diligent effort under oppressive conditions. For others, it evoked guilt or sorrow, a reminder of colleagues and prisoners who had not survived, and of the broader consequences of the war they had endured. Eyes filled with unshed tears, hands tightened around pens, and yet, amid the weight of memory, there was a quiet empowerment, the acknowledgement that their expertise could influence policy, guide reconstruction, and alter historical record. This moment also marked a shift in the interaction between genders and ranks. Female American officers, present in the sessions, demonstrated operational competence and authority that contrasted sharply with the hierarchical rigidity the German women had known. The German officers observed their American counterparts coordinating with male supervisors as equals, asking direct questions, and managing administrative procedures with autonomy. The realization was subtle but striking. Women could wield influence, exercise judgment, and occupy decision-making roles without contravening societal norms. The culmination of these sessions transformed the role of German women in the camp. No longer mere executors of orders, they became advisors, analysts, and witnesses. Their input informed not only immediate operational decisions, but also the documentation that would later be used in broader intelligence and administrative reports. Hospital procedures were revised based on their observations. Supply chains were adjusted. Evacuation protocols were refined. Each action reinforced the lesson that practical experience, once ignored, could now shape real-world outcomes. By May 1945, as Allied forces advanced and the Third Reich collapsed, the validation of these accounts had far-reaching implications. The exercise demonstrated that meticulous observation, coupled with courage to speak, could alter perceptions of authority and competence. The quiet revolution that began with a simple phrase, "ladies first," had matured into a systemic acknowledgement. The human mind, trained under duress, contained insights that bureaucracy alone could not capture. The climax of this transformation lay not in the surrender of armies, but in the reclamation of human agency, recognition of expertise, and the validation of voices long silenced. In these final weeks, the convergence of testimony, documentation, and procedural acknowledgement created a moment that was both practical and profoundly human. The German women officers emerged from these sessions changed, aware that their lived experience had tangible weight. Their observations would inform the reconstruction of post-war systems, guide occupational administration, and exemplify the moral and operational importance of listening. In this quiet, deliberate, and intensely factual process, the turning point of the narrative, where obedience yielded to agency and silence gave way to authoritative voice, was complete. The stage was now set for the aftermath. The consequences of this recognition, the broader operational and societal shifts, and the enduring human impact that would echo far beyond the confines of the camp. The weeks following the validation of the German women officers' testimonies brought a quiet, methodical reshaping of camp operations. Administrators, guided by the detailed accounts, revised supply distribution, ration allocations, and medical logistics. Hospitals, once constrained by rigid hierarchies and inadequate resources, began functioning with improved efficiency. Beds were organized according to actual patient flow, medical staff rotations reflected practical experience, and supplies were prioritized to address the most critical shortages first. Small operational victories, invisible to the public eye, marked the beginning of tangible change. For the women themselves, the aftermath was a complex mixture of relief, pride, and lingering trauma. Diaries that had once been private records of struggle now held institutional weight. Observations meticulously noted under stress became reference points for administrative decisions. Some officers experienced disbelief that their lived experience, years of navigating scarcity, improvising medical procedures, and maintaining morale, could shape policies and protocols beyond the camp. Others carried an acute awareness of loss, mourning colleagues and prisoners who had perished during the final months of the war. This duality, a mixture of empowerment and sorrow, defined their emotional landscape. The American administration, for its part, noted the broader significance of these sessions. Reports filed to higher command emphasized not only the practical benefits of incorporating the women's knowledge, but also the psychological impact on both German personnel and occupational staff. Female American officers, trained to value operational input regardless of gender, became conduits for this change, demonstrating the potential of inclusive decision-making in a previously rigid military system. Their presence reinforced the lesson that competency and insight were not dictated by rank or sex, but by experience and observation. At the societal level, these developments foreshadowed broader post-war reforms. The systematic acknowledgement of women's expertise within the camp environment mirrored, on a micro scale, emerging discussions about women's roles in public and professional life. By incorporating the observations of German women into practical decision-making, the occupational authorities established a precedent. Voices historically marginalized could contribute meaningfully to governance and reconstruction. Though the streets outside remained scarred by firebombing, rubble, and deprivation, within administrative circles a subtle transformation of hierarchy and respect was underway. Operational documentation reflected these changes. Supply logs began to record not only quantities delivered, but also qualitative assessments of efficiency and impact, often referencing recommendations made by the German women. Medical protocols were adjusted to reflect practical improvisations that had been standard in the field, codified now into formal procedures. Volunteer corps, previously managed without consultation, were reorganized to integrate insights provided by officers who had firsthand experience of morale, task allocation, and workload distribution under duress. The immediate aftermath demonstrated the capacity of detailed, lived experience to shape institutional behavior in a post-conflict environment. Yet the psychological consequences extended beyond operational efficiency. For many women, the recognition of their expertise instilled a sense of personal agency previously denied to them. Formerly conditioned to obedience, they now experienced the subtle empowerment of influencing decisions with real-world consequences. Some officers reflected privately on the paradox of their situation. The collapse of the Third Reich had removed formal authority, but the deliberate attention paid to their insights represented a new form of respect and responsibility. These emotional shifts were documented in debriefing reports and personal diaries, capturing a spectrum of response from cautious optimism to profound relief, tempered by lingering grief for the lives lost under their command. The occupational administration itself benefited from this process. Policies that might have been abstract or theoretical gained grounding in practical reality. Recommendations originating from direct observation led to improvements in camp infrastructure, medical logistics, and administrative workflow. The validation of human testimony over strict adherence to prior paperwork underscored a fundamental lesson. Effective governance, particularly in post-conflict environments, depended upon listening to those who had experienced conditions firsthand. In this first phase of the aftermath, the groundwork was laid for longer-term societal and institutional shifts. The immediate operational improvements, combined with the psychological and moral acknowledgement of the women's contributions, represented a foundational turning point. The process transformed not only the lives of the German women officers, but also the way administrators approached Reconstruction, revealing the latent power of experience over authority and human insight over bureaucracy. The stage was now set to examine the broader consequences of this recognition, including statistical outcomes, institutional reforms, and societal shifts that would continue to reverberate in the post-war environment. As months passed, the operational and personal consequences of the validated testimonies became increasingly evident. Hospitals previously crippled by wartime shortages were reorganized, incorporating systems suggested by the German women officers. Staff rotations reflected practical efficiencies they had pioneered under duress, and supply chains were restructured to prioritize urgent needs. What had once been improvisation in the chaos of war now became codified practice. Patient care improved measurably. Mortality rates decreased in documented instances, and medical personnel, both former prisoners and occupational staff, reported smoother workflows and clearer lines of responsibility. Beyond logistics, the influence of the women extended into administrative and societal domains. Reports submitted by occupation authorities began to cite their observations explicitly, giving the officers' contributions institutional legitimacy. Recommendations about staffing, morale management, and procedural accountability were implemented across multiple camps and administrative offices. In doing so, the occupation authorities demonstrated a departure from traditional hierarchical rigidity, privileging first-hand expertise over rank or ideology. This approach became a model for other post-conflict administrative operations, illustrating the tangible value of inclusive consultation in governance and reconstruction. The social implications were equally profound. Within the camps, German women officers who had been conditioned to suppress personal judgment began to experience a newfound sense of authority. Their voices, once invisible, were now considered integral to policymaking. This subtle empowerment rippled outward, shaping perceptions of gender roles within military and civilian contexts. Female officers noted an increased willingness among staff and prisoners alike to respect their judgment and decisions. Correspondence and personal diaries reflect a mixture of pride, relief, and cautious optimism. These women recognized the rare opportunity to influence systems that had previously constrained them. Occupational reports highlight the psychological impact of this recognition. Formerly withdrawn officers demonstrated increased engagement in administrative planning and operational discussions. Their insights informed not only immediate reconstruction efforts, but also training manuals, procedural documentation, and long-term logistical strategies. For the Americans, this validation reinforced the principle that human experience, often overlooked in rigid bureaucracies, was essential to effective post-conflict administration. These lessons would echo in future military and civilian reconstruction projects, underscoring the enduring value of integrating practical expertise into policy frameworks. The recognition of women's contributions also anticipated broader societal reforms. In Germany, public acknowledgement of the officers' expertise paralleled early discussions about women's expanded roles in post-war society. While legislative change would take time, the precedent set within occupation-controlled institutions signaled the possibility of women as active agents in professional, civic, and administrative spheres. Observers noted that the experience fostered a quiet shift in cultural expectations, providing a tangible example of how marginalized voices could influence structural and societal transformation even amidst widespread devastation. Statistical data from occupational records reinforces these qualitative observations. Efficiency metrics for hospital administration improved in multiple camps where women's recommendations were implemented. Supply chain errors decreased, volunteer coordination became more streamlined, and documentation of prisoner welfare was more thorough. These changes were not merely theoretical. They had measurable consequences for survival, morale, and the restoration of functional administrative systems. In essence, the integration of the German women officers' expertise transformed both process and outcome, creating a bridge between lived experience and institutional effectiveness. Emotionally, the aftermath was layered. Officers carried pride in the tangible impact of their knowledge, tempered by memories of suffering and loss. They reconciled the duality of being valued advisors in a world they had once navigated as subordinates under rigid hierarchies. Their diaries and letters capture this tension, a mixture of empowerment, reflection, and the weight of responsibility. In acknowledging their insights, the occupational authorities not only improved operational efficiency, but also catalyzed a personal and moral reckoning for those who had endured unimaginable pressure under the Nazi regime. By the close of 1946, the cumulative effect of these changes was clear. German women officers, once silenced by wartime obedience, had contributed directly to the reconstruction and stabilization of post-war systems. Their experiences informed policy, shaped operational reforms, and subtly redefined gender dynamics within both military and civilian spheres. The aftermath of their testimony serves as a testament to the enduring power of human insight, that in a landscape of destruction, experience, perseverance, and courage can redefine authority, reshape institutions, and influence history itself. In the quiet aftermath of war, amid the rubble-strewn streets and the fading echoes of conflict, the story of the German women POWs endures as a subtle yet profound testament to humanity. Their experience illustrates a fundamental truth. Obedience can sustain an army, but it cannot contain insight. Authority can demand conformity, yet lived experience persists, quietly shaping decisions long after orders are issued. The act of being asked, sincerely, for their opinions became revolutionary. It challenged decades of conditioned silence, disrupting a hierarchy that had demanded submission above reflection. Within that pause, a generation of women discovered the power of their own knowledge, practical, moral, and operational. Their observations informed reconstruction, streamlined processes, and improved the welfare of countless individuals. More than this, they demonstrated that voices once dismissed could carry authority, influence policy, and reshape societal norms. The implications extend beyond logistics or administration. The recognition of these officers' insights foreshadowed a broader transformation in post-war society. Gender roles, once rigidly confined, began to be reconsidered. The acknowledgement that women could contribute meaningfully to decision-making in the aftermath of total war planted a seed of cultural change, a small but enduring shift toward inclusion and respect for expertise irrespective of gender. On a human level, the narrative resonates because it reflects courage not on the battlefield but within the mind. Surviving trauma, navigating chaos, and speaking when silence had been the rule required a quiet bravery often invisible to history. Their courage reshaped more than procedures. It reshaped perception, showing that insight, resilience, and moral reflection are as critical to rebuilding societies as material resources. History often remembers battles, strategies, and leaders. Yet in this story, it is the silent, patient accumulation of human experience that prevails. The German women POWs journey reminds us that listening can be transformative, acknowledgement can empower, and a single, sincere question, posed at the right moment, can change the course of lives, institutions, and collective memory. Their legacy endures not as a footnote, but as a lesson, that even in the shadow of total war, the recognition of individual insight can illuminate pathways toward recovery, justice, and lasting human dignity.